Chapter 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. TW. Non.con. A man was wandering at the bottom. The torn and tattered clothes were yellow and dirty, drops of sweat mixed with dust dripped from them. The man's hair, with bright strands visible here and there, was clumped together in places as if it hadn't been combed. The limbs, as thin and dry as pieces of wood in midwinter, protruded from under the frayed fabric and moved limply. From time to time, he stopped to take a breath and then continued moving. The place the man was heading to was the very bottom of the city. A corner of that dry alley where even the pickpocket spat and turned around because no one had anything. The man's place was under a dark shade where no light could enter. He didn't eat anything today. He didn't eat anything yesterday either. The man's stomach, shrunken to the point where it couldn't even digest a sip of water, no longer cried. He knelt down on the stone road helplessly. He slowly laid his body on the ground as if he were dying. He even closed his eyelids. There was no one in the secluded alley. There was no one to hate him, no one to beat him, no one to rape him, and no one to throw him away. The black shadow of the gray wall became a blanket and blocked the crimson world that was spinning even under his eyelids. Hey, wake up! A rough kick woke the man. The consciousness, which had just been engulfed in darkness, was disturbed and returned a little. The stinky boots crashed into him to the point his bones ached and stamped on his legs a few more times without a hint of mercy. It wasn't until there was a cracking sound that the man opened his foggy eyes and floundered his arms like the legs of an insect that was having its final convulsion. The guy, who woke him up by kicking his skinny body fiercely, threw the paper bag he was holding in his hand. It fell on his face and smelled extremely light and savory. The man barely stretched out his thin hand and grabbed the paper bag. Today, I brought a special one with raisins in it. When he pulled out the paper bag and managed to tear off the awfully tough paper, a warm, freshly baked piece of bread came out of it. The smell of bread seeped into his nostrils as he breathed in the thin air. The man's mouth, which was as dry as a desert, suddenly salivated. He brought the bread closer to his face with both hands and opened his mouth. But when he took a bite of the savory food, the guy giggled and grabbed the man's ankle. He pulled down the man's dirty pants and spread his legs apart. Even in the meantime, the man was busy burying his nose in the bread and tearing it off big enough to keep his jaw from closing. The guy made him lie down on his side and spread his legs again. The skinny butt opened up again. The red flesh nestled within it was unsightly and covered in white mucus. You always manage to make me hornier than most passable prostitutes. On the subject of alpha bastards. Soon after, the guy pulled down his pants and pulled out his dark, curved penis. He cruelly shoved his fingers into the gap in the rugged red flesh that had been torn and stuck into countless times. The man who had just swallowed the bread choked and coughed. Don't pig out and relax so I can loosen your hole. The guy swung his hand like a whip and hit his skinny butt. The man shook from the great shock and dropped his bread. He got down on his knees to pick up the bread. As soon as he reached out and grabbed the rolled bread, the guy seized the man by the waist and pulled him back. You have to pay for the meal, where do you think you're running away? The guy spat on the red flesh after hitting his butt a few more times. Then he poked deeper with his finger a few more times. The man grimaced and let out a small moan, now holding the bread in his mouth. Lunatic, do you like it? The guy who poked into the hole as much as he wanted quickly shoved his unsightly erect penis to the very root. The man seemed to be screaming with his mouth full of bread, but the discomposure was so weak that even the guy's ears could not hear it. The penis entered the trembling body and moved violently as if it would tear the intestines at once. The man, unable to overcome the impact, held the bread in his arms and fell down, lifting only his hips. The saliva that flowed from between his parched lips dripped onto the black dried fruit stuck in the savory bread. Once the man was a brilliant count. There were times when even the man forgot that fact since no one called him by it, but he also had a name. Perhaps it was also of an aristocratic style. But now he was called Hey, so even if he had a long name, he would only be laughed at. After the guy was gone, the man pulled up his clothes without even wiping his thighs dripping with semen. If others saw him receive an alpha's semen, he would be subjected to the same thing until his stomach bursts with it, which he couldn't even convert into calories today. He didn't want to suffer that much. He had to hide somewhere else quickly. He grabbed the half-eaten bread. The saliva-soaked part crumbled on his rough fingers and dripped to the floor. He looked down at the crumbs with black raisins. The particularly shiny surface was extremely tempting. At long last, the man knelt down and put it in his mouth. After that, the guy with the raisin bread appeared from time to time unannounced. Sometimes he even brought a colleague along. Taking in both penises at the same time was excruciatingly painful, but more tolerable than hunger. After they left, the man hid and ate the bread. He choked up and coughed several times, but he pushed the sweet lumps down his throat. The man licked every crumb on his hand and looked away. The lights of the city's gas lamps dyed the sunken night sky scarlet. The color, which became a shimmery lace and fluttered as if the scattering of sunlight rays reached the extreme, was like the layered petals that bloomed in the garden of the Count's family, once the most splendid in the city. The man distorted his face as he looked at it blankly. He raised the corners of his lips, got up, and smiled softly, making fine lines around his eyes. Alok T. Wind. A noble among nobles with a lineage older than the current royal family. When he had just become an adult, he inherited the title after his father passed away suddenly. The young count, with gorgeous blonde hair like the family's symbol, a golden lion, and blue eyes like the azure sky, was noted for never losing his aristocratic dignity and nobility at any moment. But he wasn't like that from the beginning. Alok, did you play a lot today? Mother. A faint smell of medicine emanated from the countess as he welcomed his young son. His mother, a male Omega, was not originally healthy and was always lying in bed with a chronic disease as he forced himself to give birth to a child. The young son, not even 7 years old, climbed onto the bed clinging to his mother's skinny arms, now buried his face in his bony chest, and nodded quietly. Have you seen the rose garden? Could you tell your mother what color of roses bloomed today? The rose garden could be seen straight out of the bed's window, but he always asked his son that. Then Alok would give a lengthy explanation, using every color and exclamation in his vocabulary. Meanwhile, his mother stroked his round head that touched his chin with a hand like a dry twig. It was around his 7th birthday when his mother passed away. At that time, Alok cried until his eyes melted. At the funeral, the father standing next to his son looked as if he had lost the world and remained silent. He picked all the roses of every color from his wife's favorite garden and threw them onto the polished coffin. The father did not want any damage to the family's prestige and raised his alpha son with extreme severity. He couldn't tolerate his son constantly crying over small things, especially after he lost his mother. Where do nobles show tears? Occasionally, Alok's father caught him coming out of his mother's room in tears, took him to the study, and gave him a severe beating. Alok couldn't even rub his swollen legs and had to hold back his tears. When he missed his mother, he hid from his father and cried in the shade of the corner of the rose garden. He would tremble and sniffle, until the butler, who had the same stern expression as his father but held his hand kindly, came and hugged him affectionately. His eyes were red and swollen, buried in the scent of roses, and he couldn't easily stop his tears, saddened by the fading scent of his mother in his memory. After some time, the rain and wind made all the roses fall to the ground. In the meantime, through his father's scolding, he straightened his shoulders and held his head upright. To walk gracefully without running no matter what, the 7-year-old had forgotten how to cry and had learned to smile. His father, an aristocrat to the core, devoted his all to his duties as a nobleman. He did not simply assert and show off his authority but gave as much as he could for society with the enormous wealth he gathered from his massive territory. Of course, the method was extremely aristocratic. While donating a significant amount to charity for starving children in the slums, he never directly got involved in the bottom. Rather, he hated the lowermost part of the city. It seems that he was displeased with the fact that such a filthy and lowly space existed in the capital within the reach of the count's authority. So his father decided to borrow someone else's hand. Among the commoners, the highly educated gentry or the collateral families who did not inherit the title among the nobles were sponsored and made to deal with unclean things on his behalf instead. It turned into a big event with considerable influence in conjunction with another tradition of the Count's family, tea party in the Rose Garden. Since his father, fussy by nature and not in good health, was often sick, Aylock took over as the host of the tea party from the age of 19. The young man, though not young enough to still be wet behind the ears, greeted and chatted with the guests with a subtle smile, wearing a navy suit that was adorned with his blue eyes and dark blonde hair, paragon of the Count family. Unlike others, it wasn't that difficult for him to do so. No matter what the other person said, all he had to do was say, "I see." All the young people looking for a patron were eager to get his attention. Even though all of them were a few years older than Aylock, they were busy uttering words that bordered on flattery. Chapter 2. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Shameless fools. Aylock laughed at them inwardly. There were many things more important than money in the world. Those who had learned soul-moving melodies, heart-shaking phrases, mind-blowing beautiful masterpieces, and endlessly deep classics will not be in a hurry to sell themselves so cheaply. Aylock was not interested in them, but he couldn't get rid of the will of his father, who passed away the previous year, so he only smiled gracefully. The vulgar labor market masqueraded as a tea party was not all that interesting from the start, and the aristocratic sense of duty to lead it soon ran out. Aylock used his non-existent cousin as an excuse to get away from the people and escaped from the garden filled with the thick scent of roses. He made his way to his favorite cedar trail by a shortcut known only to those who have stayed in the huge mansion for a long time. The trees lined up on one side of the well-polished path stretched straight up toward the sky. The huge trees were planted by the first count who first built this mansion. They may not have been this big at first, but following the history of the family of counts, which started as a humble family and now stood side by side with the royal family, they had now become giant trees to look up to. A cool breeze blew through the towering trees, making the leaves rustle. The irritation that had soared a moment ago was erased in an instant. He walked slowly and inhaled the bitter smell of wood to the fullest. Aylock loved to stroll along this path and hated being disturbed. So, the servants of the mansion never came in this way, and the butler took care that invited guests would not, unintentionally, disturb the Count's private break time, so only Aylock could enjoy himself. Well, that's the way it had to be. But who was the one standing far away and looking this way? As the owner of the mansion, it was absolutely impossible to go back to avoid outsiders. Rather, it was right to send out the guest who entered the space unauthorized. By all means, a little humiliation in return for a nasty intrusion would be fine. Aylock approached him with a smile. When he got close enough to talk to him, he was sure that the person would shout out a name he obviously didn't want to remember and gush about how much he was worth the investment. Aylock observed the other person as he narrowed the distance, thinking about what kind of humiliation he should inflict on the unpleasant intruder. Taller than average, he straightened his shoulders and looked this way. Dark auburn hair and slightly tanned, healthy skin. Neat forehead and nose bridge and cheekbones that gave off an extremely tough impression. The firmly closed mouth fit perfectly with the sharp jawline as if it had been sculpted. Contrary to his stern expression and firm posture, which made him seem like an awfully proud person, the look in his deep-set eyes was pure and honest, unlike the lowly guys who swarmed the garden. The closer he got, the more he filled his vision, like a warlord with a huge cedar tree at his back. Before he knew it, the desire to humiliate him was gone. Even when the distance between them got closer than necessary, Aylock didn't say anything and simply stared into the dark brown eyes. He was flustered by the awkward atmosphere, but fortunately, his father's strict discipline shone through. You must have lost your way. Yes. Even when asked politely, he only gave a blunt answer without any other rhetoric. Even though he only heard one syllable, Alok felt that his voice was extremely mellow. The low, resonant, and serious voice matched his appearance very well. I will show you the way. I am looking for a specific rose garden, but I cannot find it because the garden itself is so large. A slightly softened answer came back to this offer. It seems that he was also invited to the tea party. However, the air he carried was different from the common swarm of ants. He didn't make a fuss when he saw Alok, nor did he look at him with an interested gaze. Rather, he merely saluted in an attitude that showed off moderate etiquette as if he were indifferent. He didn't say his name, and he didn't even ask Alok's. This was the first time something of this sort had ever happened. Even complete strangers behaved intimately as if they had found a lost brother when they saw a young man in fine clothes, with bright blonde hair, blue eyes, sophisticated manners, and a gentle smile. Alok thought he had met someone interesting after a long time. It didn't take long to go around the shortcut and get to the place where one could see the rose garden. In the meantime, the man kept a little distance and silently accompanied him. Alok was curious about this man's name, so he introduced himself first in spite of his face. My name is Alok T. Win. Before it was too late, Alok turned and asked right in front of the Oriental Arbor. Vitae barrier, out of sight of others. The tall man only lowered his eyes instead of his head and looked at the hand held out in front of him. He held his hand at a speed that was neither fast nor slow, too brief to be called hesitation, and answered as concisely as before. Klop Bandike. Other than that, it was an unimaginably fitting name. That's right. For this man, the term appellation was more appropriate than the simple term name. The combination of sound, echo, and harmony of meanings was close to perfection. The lean hand was so large that it was able to cover the nobleman's soft, white hand, and even though he held it lightly without force, Alok could feel the strength of will in it. He looked up into Klop's eyes. In those dark eyes that didn't falter at all, he saw a person. Alok smiled. He didn't even have to force it. He was just overflowing with inexplicable joy and excitement that brought a bright smile to the whole face. Earning coins by working on a daily wage basis was a privilege given only to a few. Even the few jobs of a day laborer were reserved for those who advertised their abilities and sold themselves. There were more days of starvation than days of eating. A simple errand to earn 2 coins was not properly given to a person who was left with only scarred skin and bones. Even so, he was able to live without starving because there were broad-minded people who would even pay for his rotten body. He hid in a deeper, darker shade so as not to be deprived of the half-eaten bread. The moment he folded his legs and crouched down in a corner to chew on the freshly baked bread, he felt excruciating pain as if his intestines were being torn apart. He knelt down on the ground, trying not to lose his clouding vision. Then he curled up. It was already the 3rd time. The first time was so painful that he struggled and scratched the floor until his fingernails fell off and he passed out, but the second time, only his heart pounded and it was bearable. It was a common occurrence when selling one's body on the street. It just hurt terribly. He crawled into a deeper, more closed alley in the throes that felt like a knife swinging his intestines. A foul-smelling, yellow liquid flowed down the crotch of the already soiled pants, along with the red fluid that governed life. He pulled down his pants with trembling hands and placed his skinny bottom on the cold stone ground. He grimaced with the bread in his mouth and bawled in pain. After a while, a lump of red flesh swelled up and squeezed through the gap, and a black clot of blood came out. It was a person the size of a palm, stored in a sticky, shiny membrane. It seemed that he had lost consciousness at some point. As he raised his dizzy head, he saw the rosy sky. He lifted his upper body with his wobbly arms. Roll. The hardened bread, hard to discern from how much it had been bitten, rolled. He lay down on the cold stone ground and pulled his stiff legs together. He pulled what was falling out with a numb hand. No matter how many times he went through it, the feeling of falling between his legs was terrible and vexing. Unknowingly, he let out a cry. The gaping throat blew out air like a broken flute. He used his hollow voice that couldn't even be imbued with grief as a dirge and raised what had not even formed with his hands. Even this clot of blood spilled out red tears from its undivided eyes, but nothing spilled out of the man's eyes. Barely controlling his staggering legs, he pulled up his clothes and walked with the corpse of a human who knew how to cry. Towards the place where the tears of the sky gather and flow down. Don't be born like this next time. He forcefully moved his mouth to say, farewell, and set the red rose petal-like thing afloat on the river. The whole way back was a kaleidoscope. The flower-like sky, the cool shade, the black stone path, and the calmly flowing river. Everything was jumbled up and spun round and round. His dry eyes were stiff. For that reason, he couldn't keep up with the dancing world. He couldn't think of anything, whether it was about where he was going or if it was right to go this way. The mumbling noise in his ears was full of incomprehensible profanity. He couldn't tell whether it was a real human voice or an illusion. There was nothing left of the body that created a person, so it was pushed away even by the wind that could not blow a single leaf. After all the bodily fluids had evaporated, the body, like dried leaves, rolled and rolled around until it reached a certain corner of a street. He could hear the sounds of wheels rolling swiftly along with the powerful clatter of the horses' hooves on the stone path. When he looked up, several black carriages passed by. The place where he couldn't get his act together was the end of the maze that continued from the slums, a huge square. The square leading directly to the nearby riverside doubled as a crossroads for numerous carriages. There was usually a lot of traveling, but today was particularly busy. He stood blankly and stared vacantly at the various seals. There were quite a few familiar ones among them. Barons, viscounts, dukes, counts, and sometimes even those of royalty, all remained the same. The long period of time, when the once noble existence had now become a mass of filth that was less than a piece of trash, was not even a fleeting moment for those families with a long history. There was nothing to change. He was the only one who had changed. The only thing missing was a family that came to an end because of his stupidity. For others, today was a day like any other. Even if he kept looking at it, he couldn't even touch that world of light anymore. Even if he tried to touch it, the only thing that would happen would be the dry tips of his hand burning at a terrifying speed. He had to turn around. The reason he couldn't turn around right away wasn't that he had lingering regrets. It was just that the body didn't listen. He barely lifted his feet before turning his hunched back, then slowly turned his shriveled shoulders, and finally tried to turn his dazed head. Just then, a black carriage came running this way from afar. Why did the 4 horses with shiny manes and the sturdy, solemn-looking carriage seem to glimmer when they were no different from the others? The head that had just turned around returned to its previous pose. The galloping carriage tore through the wind and passed by narrowly. It was then that he saw it. A clear silhouette among blurry beings. Chapter 3. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. A man who he could never forget could be seen through the transparent window of the carriage without a single handprint. The man, with his dark auburn hair compactly slicked back, cradled a happily smiling blonde child on his lap. The blue eyes of the child collided with that of the hobo watching. Oh! He knew that child. That lovely angel. And the man who held the child very affectionately. He knew those 2 beautiful people and that he, who was crawling at the bottom, couldn't reach them no matter what. *****Aylock was in an extremely bad mood. The hall of the Count's mansion, where a grand banquet was being held, was full of people laughing with ha-has and ho-hos, but none of the merry-looking faces had what Aylock wanted. The person he was looking for was a man with creases in the middle of his forehead and a blank expression that made him look like he was a little angry. "Aylock, you look especially beautiful today." "Excuse me." A man who seemed to recognize his face at first glance approached, pretending to be friendly. Even from a few steps away, he gave off such a strong odor that made his nose rot, and he blatantly flirted with Alok with a fishy smile. He didn't care that he was an alpha as well, or that they were both males, which no longer had any meaning, and was once taboo set by God. Rather, he was an awfully crude man who followed the vulgar trend of hooking up casually with the same alpha or omega without having to take any responsibility. The other person's pride was not hurt at all even when Alok pushed him away with a cold smile. Instead, he approached an omega the same way he did previously with the same relaxed and vulgar eyes, as if he were enjoying himself. Immediately after seeing him say the exact same thing he had just said to the omega, Alok left, feeling like vomiting for even breathing the same air for a few seconds as they stood together. Even so, the gaze did not stop scanning people. Bedo dem, where the hell are you? In his hands gathered behind his waist as she wandered around, he held an invitation that he had written with a pounding heart a few days ago. The invitation, which was especially handwritten, was retrieved from the entrance. It meant that he had come. However, he could not be seen for several hours. He couldn't let go without saying goodbye. This banquet was all just an excuse to meet him. Eventually, footmen were mobilized to find him. They quietly walked around the banquet hall to carry out their master's orders. Soon after, a footman who had gone out into the garden returned and reported that he was on the way to the cedar trail. The count's expressionless face, which had been as cold as a piece of marble until just a moment ago, was colored with joy, like drops of ink spreading on water. Alok headed for the cedar trail almost as fast as he could run. The path was illuminated by the blue moonlight, with orange lanterns under each tree, adding to the subtle atmosphere. Originally, this path was not to be decorated with anything, but seemed to like the cedar trail, so he purposely ordered it to be lit with lanterns. Of course, there was also a footman who cleverly diverted the other guests to prevent anyone else from entering. Alok took a deep breath and calmed his pounding heart. His pride still did not allow him to show his emotions and act like a puppy who met his owner. He was already aware that he was getting a little confused. He knew very well that it was unsightly to get excited alone when the other person didn't display any meaningful words or actions. At the same time, there was also a sense of resentment towards the other person who made him so restless. Could he not act friendly with him once in a while? Even when everyone else flattered him, who had wealth, fame, and prestige, the man showed no interest. No, he pretended not to. If he really wasn't interested, why did he respond to his invitation? Surely there must be some goodwill. He deliberately grabbed the invitation he had sent to him and came out. He thought of making a little joke using the invitation as an excuse, in case it would be awkward again like before. Something like, "Must I write it in my own handwriting for you to accept it? How about gifting me ink and a pen for my upcoming birthday?" Of course, considering his financial situation, he knew the appropriate price range and the right craftsman for the items. The astute butler would give him a hint along with his coat. He wanted to sit next to him at his birthday banquet, which was a month away. The light flickered through the walls of the cedar trees that separated the rose garden not far away. There was a shadow. Alok deliberately slowed down his steps as he tried to harden his slightly relaxed expression. It was to not let the other person know he was approaching him. He wanted to see his natural expression. When he had asked why he puts on such a serious expression, he answered by saying that he looked this way even when no one was around. Seeing him waiting for someone with a big physique and a serious expression seemed like an interesting sight in its own way. Alok walked gently, feeling the pebbles through his smooth leather shoes. The tall body reflected in the dim light was clearly visible. The distance quickly narrowed, and now only a single tree with countless small leaves stood between them. He was muttering to himself. When he imagined him talking to himself with such a serious face, he almost felt like smiling. Alok couldn't stand it any longer, so he hurriedly went around the tree to reveal himself. "See you here again, Clop." Clop, surprised by the sudden appearance, opened his eyes a little wide and turned his head to look this way. The moment their eyes met, Alok couldn't believe it. The deep eyes, which had only cast sharp glances every time, were slightly squinted, and his mouth, which was always tightly closed and barely gave out necessary answers, drew a soft curve. Klopp was smiling. The heavily fortified defense posture collapsed all at once. The Count's rather white face instantly turned a pale rose. He could not believe that an insipid and serious man like him was smiling. Could it be because of him? Alok managed to suppress the urge to run and stand by his side at once. His heart swelled. It was not a one-sided feeling either. It could not be one-sided. Any Omega in the world, even most Alphas, wanted Alok Tewin. There was no way that a low-ranking aristocrat who had nothing else backing him up other than an intelligent mind and tall body would reject him. Alok approached with a big smile, overjoyed at the thought of having him at last. Alok. I could not find you even after sending out such an invitation, so I came to look for you. Must I really send a handwritten invitation like this? You do not even have a title, but aren't you a little too haughty? The man's smiling expression became serious again. To the point Alok wondered if he had a chronic illness that was worsening as he looked at him. However, since he had just confirmed that it was all just a front, he thought it would be okay to take it off little by little over time. Alok approached Klopp, naturally invading the polite confines of his personal space. He was thinking of asking him if he was interested in the, which he had recently purchased at a high price. But he didn't. It was because he belatedly realized that he was not alone just as he was about to grab Klopp's arm without losing his smile. Beyond, obscured by Alpha's large frame, stood a small man with blonde hair and blue eyes similar to Alok's. He was a little embarrassed when he saw Alok, but greeted him in a rather polite manner. Hello, Count Tewin. Thank you for inviting me to the party. Alok knew him. He was the son of a distant relative whom he had only seen once when his father died. The eldest son of Viscount Westport, a cousin to Alok. His name was probably Raphael. He didn't remember inviting him, but it seemed he was on the Count's basic list of guests starting from the funeral. The Omega leaned against Klopp's waist with his hand. Also, the Alpha's sturdy arm was wrapped around his small shoulders. It was only after looking at them alternately that Alok noticed. Klopp's smile was directed at the Omega, not him, and his frown right now was not a pretense, but the truth. In an instant, an unbearable sense of shame and contempt soared. Alok looked at the two of them alternately, opened and closed his mouth, then quickly turned around. Though he was the owner of this mansion, he ran away to avoid the guests. Alok's head was filled with unreachable fantasies. It was a remnant of the person he had forgotten at some point while rolling around on the cold stone ground. The fantasy was as beautiful as it was ephemeral that it made him forget time. He crouched down with his knees up and placed his hands neatly on them. He pressed his cheek to the back of his hand again. He tried to imitate the happy smile of the man who left an unforgettable mark on him and the child who inherited his blood. Even in the midst of such misery, an overwhelming feeling leaked out from his heart. Could life be a blessing once more? Will it lead us to the light again? Will I ever see him again under those cedar trees? Someday again. Yes. That's why. Let's live. T/N. Hello. I forgot to add this note in the first chapter, but I would like to request those who are reading this to also read my comment under this novel on NU, Novel Updates, as I have listed out a few pointers for the readers. It's mainly for your own sake since the first volume could get quite overwhelming for some. That's all, thank you for reading. Take care, happy face. Chapter 4. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Once he decided to live, he couldn't stay like this. If asked why he couldn't stay like this, he wouldn't have anything to say, but he wanted to get ready like a widow who puts out yellow flowers by the window today for her husband who will return tomorrow. He went down to the river to avoid people's eyes. The river, immersed in darkness, reflected light from somewhere and flowed like a black snake with white scales. The petals sent away a while ago must have already flowed into the sea with the flow. It may have already met in the sea with the 2 petals that had been sent away before. He washed his face and hair with the cloudy water that he could not see the bottom of. He also washed clothes that were covered with filth all over. It was difficult to knead the wet, tough cloth with his weak and dry fingers. No matter how many times he splashed and rubbed the stain in the water, it did not come off properly. It was probably because he had never really done his laundry. I should have learned it beforehand. Regret seeped in even the smallest things. For now, it was important to clean his clothes somehow, so he dipped himself naked into the cold river until his fingertips were wrinkled. He wasn't used to washing his body in cold running water without soap or a brush. He tripped several times on the jagged rocks underneath. He drank some water, too. But he washed himself for as long as he could. Oh, God! This is a disaster. It was good to wash at night, avoiding people's eyes, but it was too cold to wear wet clothes at dawn. Alok rummaged through a pile of trash in a sequestered place to find something to warm his shivering body. But he couldn't find anything to cover himself with. If he were to stay like this, his body temperature would drop to a dangerous level. It was suicidal to endure the night with a body that had reached the extreme and had no fat left to burn. How long had it been since he made up his mind to live? After hesitating, Alok left his hiding place and headed for another alley. Hey, wake up! You have to pay for your meal. Alok opened his eyes to a wild kick in his leg. He woke up in a shabby shed that could shield him from the night dew, even though it was full of nasty odors. The old, dusty blanket covering him was soaked with the semen Alok had received all night. When he woke up and moved, the man who kicked him immediately left the shed. The clothes thrown by the head side were almost parched. Before putting them on, Alok ran his fingers up his anus to scrape out the semen and wiped it between his legs on the blanket. He ignored the pain and forced his legs, which were about to cramp, to stand up and went outside. The man who had asked for 3 rounds of sex the previous night in return for giving him a warm blanket and a place to hide from the night dew offered him something to eat this time. How many times, you pigged out on everything my balls had to offer, so there's nothing to feed. Do the work instead. The man pointed at the sack of flour with his thick, hairy hand. Alok looked at it blankly, not knowing what it meant. The man said bluntly, "Move that over there. Keep in mind that if you drop it and it tears open, making it of no use, I will twist your neck. Never come into a kitchen with a brazier. Because I don't want anything to be infected with germs." He wrapped his white apron around his waist and entered what appeared to be the kitchen. Alok did as he was told and picked up a sack of flour the size of his torso. To be precise, after picking it up and staggering, he kept it back down, and after struggling several times, he managed to pick it up and put it on the stone plate next to the kitchen that the man had pointed at. Even moving one made all his joints tingle, and even his teeth shook from how much effort he put into it. Is there anything heavier than this in the world? While Alok was breathing heavily and rubbing his knees and wrists down, the man looked out and yelled, "If you don't move quickly, you won't even get a single moldy bread." Alok was startled by the thunderous voice and nodded. He quickly moved to shift the second sack of flour. That afternoon, for the first time in his life, Alok got 2 pieces of bread and some sugar in exchange for sound labor. In terms of money, it was cheap physical labor, slightly less than a coin. When he looked down blankly at what he had earned with his own hands for the first time, the man exclaimed that it was very generous considering the quality of the labor provided. Probably not wrong. Alok's legs were shaking and his arms were weak from moving all day. One of the approximately 30 sacks of flour fell to the floor, and the end of the bag tore open, spilling white flour. For that reason, his thigh was kicked severely, but the man didn't act as cruelly since he was working in the bakery and handed the wages to Alok. He tore off the white inside of the precious bread he had earned through hard labor, dipped it in soft brown sugar, and put it in his mouth. It was the most delicious thing he had ever eaten. He wanted to look at the special bread for a little longer, so he tried to save it, but when he came to his senses, he had eaten the whole piece. He was drooling and the remaining sugar and the other piece of bread kept catching his eyes, but he firmly tightened the bag and held it in his hand. If he ate it all today, he would have to starve tomorrow. He saved the bread today because he learned on the streets that it was more important to avoid tomorrow's hunger than be full right now. This was also his very first savings. While staying in the bakery's shed, he had no choice but to spread his legs whenever the man asked for it, but Alok said he wanted to work as much as possible. Then the man was not quite happy about that. However, he then nodded his head gladly, as if he had changed his mind. Instead, the man asked if it would be okay to try something different for the night. Okay. But from now on, don't do it inside. Kek. What's this from an alpha whore? I don't want to do it otherwise. Humph, fine. Fortunately, he thought Alok was an alpha. This was because there were no specific symptoms of heat and the omega body scent was not properly developed. To be honest, even Alok didn't know when his heat would come. One day after his stomach was full, he would know that the heat period had passed and that another pregnancy had ended at the same time, only when a clot of red blood escaped through the space between his crotch. The body that changed one day was still unfamiliar. He quickly found out what the new thing the man was talking about wanting to try. One night he showed up with 3 or 4 of his colleagues. He had taken 2 at the same time, but it was the first time he had ever dealt with so many alphas. What was worse was that they had big bulky bodies. They grabbed Alok's limbs, which he kept trying to pull back in fear, and played with them like toys, violating his torn anus several times. Is he an alpha? Why is he acting up like this? He smells like an alpha. There was an omega too, but this guy adored him too much, so here we are. The men in turn violated the skinny body, and at the same time, they inserted their penises and started pouring in a huge amount of semen. Alok was struggling with the pain of his anus being torn and glared at the man who had promised and argued. Ugh. Ah. I told you. Not to do it inside. Ugh. I didn't. This guy did. Kekek. He couldn't control his already numb body and simply bit his lips and left it in their cruel hands. Soon after, his entire body was overflowing with semen. After they left, having satisfied their needs, Alok started to vomit. The semen he couldn't swallow flowed down his nose with the vomit. After throwing up the semen, he spread his rear open and scraped out what was left by inserting his fingers into the anus where screams leaked by just touching it. If he wasn't biting the blanket, he might have bitten his tongue. He shoved his finger in again and again, which only left stains of blood on the tip of his dirty fingernails. Alok buried his pale face in this blanket and fell down. It was terribly painful to deal with multiple people at the same time. While the bud vision grew darker, the strangely hazy brain completely ignored the owner's command of not wanting to think of anything. He was once again reminded of what he had done. Perhaps the crimes he had committed, a little more appalling than this, caused him to raise his head. Raphael Westport was definitely an omega. He was short and, of course, small enough to fit into one arm. Even though he was an omega, he was a male, so it was rare for a person to develop such protective instincts over him. Instead, there was nothing superior about him compared to Alok except for being an omega. He was not well educated, nor did he have any special talents. In an aristocratic society, he was just an ordinary human being, as common as stones rolling by the side of the road. It wasn't even that he had outstanding beauty. He obviously had a cute side and was worth looking at, but one wouldn't be caught dead calling him beautiful. Despite the stark differences between alphas and omegas, it was close to impossible to call Raphael more beautiful than Alok, no matter how much he lowered the sharp standards of aesthetic sense. Unlike the Count, who looked somewhat temperamental but was as handsome as if he were in a painting. Raphael's cutesy features could be reckoned as charming only when he was looked upon generously. Besides, his blonde hair was duller than Alok's, and his blue eyes were patched with grey in places, much inferior to Alok's iris, which was like the wings of a flawless blue. And yellow macaw. House Westport, distant relatives of House T. Wind, was not so insignificant, but they were not a family that could certainly support their son. In law. Why did he like such a worthless person? He might have been convinced if he was dating a completely different person. Klopp wasn't a person to like someone who was Alok's inferior in every way just because he was an Omega. It was also true that they were judged as similar enough to be mistaken for siblings sometimes, despite the obvious differences in level that would be unpleasant to even mention. There must have been another reason for choosing Raphael over anyone else. After thinking about it, he decided that it was a kind of provocation. It may have been a tactic to avoid giving the initiative to the Taywin's Alok. It was very childish, but it had a significant effect. Whenever he saw the two of them affectionately clinging to each other, Alok was overcome with fiery jealousy. In the late evening, when he was getting ready to leave after the boring banquet of Viscount Derbyshire, which he had only accepted to meet Klopp, he waited in the Viscount's lobby for his carriage to arrive. Alok paced the corridor with his complexion a little hardened as people rushed all at once, crowding the area with carriages. Over there, at the edge of the dimly lit garden, he saw two people clinging to each other. The only place young aristocrats who had reached marriageable age could freely date was at gatherings of prestigious aristocratic families. It was because being invited directly to the other person's house even though they are not particularly engaged symbolized a very secret relationship during heat or for other reasons, so it was a matter of unnecessary gossip. Since he had not yet heard that Klopp had personally sought Raphael, it was clear that the relationship between the two was nothing more than an innocent exchange. But no matter how concealed and gloomy the place, which couldn't be found unless one deliberately looked for it, they were still clinging to each other like that in the open garden of another mansion that was not their own. Are they out of their mind? He was displeased and thought about simply ignoring it, but since Raphael was his relative, he decided to tell him to be cautious out of consideration of their shared reputation. They whispered something in each other's ears with low laughter, unaware that another person was approaching. The discomfort was intense. As he moved closer, Klopp held Raphael's hands together and kissed the ends of each of the fingers wrapped in bandages. Alok couldn't close his mouth in shock. Klopp said as he held Raphael's fingertips to his lips, and had his characteristic deep gaze fixed on the little Omega. No matter how rough and scarred they are the most beautiful and dearest hands to me. At those words, Raphael's face blushed, and he only called out his name, Klopp. It wasn't a simple pretense. He was a naive Omega sincerely in love from every angle, and the Alpha, who gently wrapped his long arms around him, lowered his head and kissed his forehead as if he was very lovely. That was it. Alok didn't have the vulgar audacity to the point where he even watched others kiss. Chapter 5 You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Alok's legs trembled and his hands became tense as he passed the short corridor. The sound of shoe heels was much faster and louder than usual. Perhaps, if his father were still alive and had witnessed this scene, he would have dragged him to the study even now as an adult and swung at him with a cane. The carriage was ready just in time. Alok quickly jumped into the carriage with the coat put on his shoulders by the servant of Viscount Derbyshire. The carriage, which started right away, accelerated a little more when Alok gave the signal. In the shaking carriage, Alok was finally able to lower the corners of his twitching lips. It occurred to him belatedly that this might be his own illusion. Alok's pride was so hurt that he almost lost his reason. Even when Klopp accepted the Count's invitation, he was with Raphael. Klopp wouldn't show up without Raphael, so he had to invite him. Seeing the two of them stroll together affectionately and hug each other, he couldn't come to his senses with jealousy. How could this be? It was prevalent at the time, but under the pretext of a trend that he despised so much, Alok made Klopp an offer that was worse than that of a pig in heat. Obviously, he expected to be rejected. However, he thought that if he appealed this far, Klopp would show some sympathy. He wanted him to the point he was complacent with even his pride being shattered. However, the merciless Klopp, without a doubt, trampled on the offer with cruel words, which led Aylock to experience the strange sensation of trembling and burning under and around his eyes. He thought he could humiliate him a little with his refined approach, but he never imagined that he would be criticized so starkly. He didn't understand the situation at all and hated Klopp and his lover for making him feel this misery. Aylock decided never to act as if he knew them again. He walked along the cedar trail to control the jealousy that boiled even if he stayed still, but it didn't help to stabilize his mind and body. Rather, it was painful because the bitter and cool scent resembled the body scent of someone he didn't want to think of. For a while, he shut himself up at home, engrossing himself in music, reading, horseback riding, chess, and anything else that could distract him. In the library, he read classics over and over again with strong tea, and later even read gardening books that he rarely read. After spending a few months close to domiciliary confinement, the things he had forcibly filled his head with finally drove away the memories he didn't want to recall. Aylock was able to smile smoothly again and held the tea party he had been putting off. It occurred to him that it would be better to do his duty as an aristocrat and have a good conversation with a comfortable group of people than be alone. As he exchanged casual greetings and talked about things in and out of the country, he felt like he was back to being the way he was before everything. No, he was mistaken for that. An alpha who liked to spread nonsense around heard the news that Klopp and Raphael were engaged. The slightly hardened smile soon grew wider. It should have stopped then. If it was difficult to pretend not to see them, he should have gone on a long cruise to avoid seeing them at all. But Aylock didn't. The ugly jealousy was not removed by months of confinement. On the contrary, it seemed that he was dissatisfied with what he was trying to suppress, and what seemed like a subtle lump of charcoal was engulfed in explosive flames and burned roaringly. The young couple, who had got engaged and married before the end of the year, was called to many gatherings. Klopp, who had become in charge of the family, started a personal investment management business, so it was only natural for him to strengthen his connections. It was also because many people liked the newlywed couple very much. Aylock had to suffer the pain of his guts being burned as he watched the happy couple. To begin with, he didn't have a bad appearance, but after getting married, Raphael shone more brightly than ever before. Even Aylock had to admit that. Seeing him naturally leaning in the arms of his husband, who embraced him very affectionately, with his cheeks flushed as if he were dreaming, people called him lovely rather than impudent. A terrible sense of defeat and humiliation rose up. He knew all too well that even if he had been an Omega and had become a couple with Klopp, he would never be able to do it like that. Something he could never have. It was the first setback he had suffered. It was disappointment and anger toward himself. The first time in anything was unfamiliar and hard to handle. The vicious feeling, which was barely being controlled at a certain level, finally began to encroach on Aylock when he saw Raphael, with a large belly that could not be hidden, surrounded by everyone receiving blessings at Viscount Derbyshire's tea party some time later. It broke the dam of rationality that had barely been blocked and began to pour down fiercely. The Alpha, who was soon to be the father of the child, kissed the top of the Omega's head, as he sat down exhausted as if he couldn't help himself any longer, then sneered at the man looking at them from a little distance, who probably had an extremely ugly complexion on. That act had gobbled up the Count, who was already deluged with overwhelming emotions, from head to toe. When the person who firmly believed that he had never been hurt before found his torn heart for the first time, even more so when he had pried close to arrogance, the unfamiliar wound encouraged unintentional recklessness. Whether by chance or unconsciously, Aylock found himself standing at the bottom where he had never set foot in his life, threw gold coins to a pack of dogs with servile eyes and strong fangs, and demanded them to bite the loveliest bride in the world. He was bitten by the harsh teeth of a pack of dogs, but not to the point of death. The next day, though his limbs were squeaky, Aylock was clearly alive. Is it because there was no dignity left to die? Or was it simply because the time to die had not come yet? He couldn't quite understand. The men seemed to like Alok. It wasn't short, but at intervals that couldn't be said to be a long time, they rushed in and had sex with him. As he rolled around at the bottom, fears that hadn't arisen since his first miscarriage returned. He didn't want to go through something like that again. Since he had no pride to defend, Alok tried to take it with his mouth so that they wouldn't ejaculate inside, but in the end, he had to take it down there a couple of times. Alok, tired and unable to fall asleep right away, stood up and staggered to find a place to wash himself. It has been a while since he started living in the bakery shed, but he was still not allowed inside the house. It was unavoidable. There was no one at the bottom who would welcome a male prostitute who had been rolling on the streets into their house. The shed was just a storage room full of dust and cobwebs, a place where old tools were stored, so there was no place to wash himself right away. Alok limped and had to make it to the river, which was quite far away. The huge black snake flowed as it flashed its shiny silver scales today. The cold tongue rose up the bony ankles, calves, knees, and thighs, washing away the filth that didn't belong to Alok. After overcoming the risk of dying from hypothermia while washing late at night, he decided to wash only the necessary parts. Alok recoiled from the cold water digging into his body. He wanted to get out of the piercing cold water, but if he didn't wash thoroughly, something else might happen. He had no idea when his heat came and went, and repeated miscarriages didn't mean that he couldn't get pregnant. Alok hoped that nothing would happen this time, and did not get out of the water until he almost lost all sensation in his lower body. After a while, when he began shivering to the top of his head, he moved his numb feet and came out. He didn't even have to wipe it, so he shook off the water and put on his pants. His thin pants clung to his wet legs. Alok rubbed his thighs with his hands, trying to suppress the persistent goosebumps, but to no avail. He wanted to go back to the shed and rest. He turned around the alley, and couldn't quite see where he was going as he was trying to detach the cloth clinging to his legs, with his upper body bent down. When he looked up, he was on the wrong street again, and it was a strangely bright street corner. He blinked his eyes as he blocked the artificial light flying into his eyes with his hands. It seems that he came to the front of the night tea house at some point. Alok was surprised by the gaze of the people who were staring at the suddenly appearing vagrant and quickly turned around. Beyond the bottom, he was nothing more than a bug. He would be beaten to death just for looking. In the first year of being abandoned on these streets, it was something he learned deep within his bones. Alok ran towards the darkness, constantly checking to see if anyone was following him. The smell of the gutter guided him even without having to look ahead. But the smell was soon blocked by something else. The legs, which had been moving blindly, took a few more steps unconsciously, causing Alok to bump into someone. Ugh! He quickly covered his mouth with both hands and crouched down. It was an instinctive act so that he would be beaten a little less. But no kicks or punches flew in. The person who bumped into Alok only made a curt remark in a displeased voice. "Watch where you are going." The tightly closed eyes flashed open. The cool hem of his clothes brushed against him as he crouched down. Like a wish carried away by the sun, Alok unconsciously turned toward the hem of his clothes, stood up of his own accord, and followed him as if bewitched. Then he stretched out his rough fingers and grabbed the luxurious fabric that looked to be of a deep color even under dim streetlights. The other person stopped and looked back. Dark eyes and furrowed eyebrows. Tightly closed lips. "What? Do you have something to say?" Voice with a deep resonance. Alok moved one step closer. His dull face, half hidden by the darkness, was revealed under the orange colored light. The other person who saw him frowned. Clop. Only then did the other person open his eyes wide as if surprised by the call that came out unexpectedly easily. Alok. Clop stiffened a little as if he was shocked, then immediately raised the corners of his mouth. And he slapped Alok's hand, which was holding the hem of his clothes, rather roughly. After patting the somewhat creased hem several times, he let out a familiar sneer. "It appears that you have not died yet, have you? Oh, what are you hurting for?" Alok was a little surprised that his inner sense of pain was still functioning. He thought it was completely dead, but it seems that it wasn't. Instead, he was able to smile quite easily because he had lost the ability to leap out of control altogether. He had nothing to answer to the question of whether he was still alive, so he just replied with an ordinary greeting. "It has been a while." He was not flustered as he had peeled off another layer of his tattered heart when he happened to see him and the child. As if he had been waiting for this moment, Alok naturally looked closely at Klop. He had no idea how many years had passed, but at least it didn't seem to bring any change to this strong alpha. Klop was still as strong and as beautiful as a mythical hero. Not to mention, the obvious sneer on the lips that he once believed to be emotionless. "Right, as you said, it has been a while. I never expected to meet you in a place like this. It is a street that I happened to pass by. Oh, I see that you were out. I could not recognize you at all since you are so lightly dressed." Klop, with a deliberately exaggerated display of delight, blatantly looked down at Alok's bare feet. Alok looked down at the same time, moving his feet slightly with a flushed face. Then, he quietly hid his hands behind his back. Seeing that, Klop smiled a little. "Does Count T-Wind have a lot of worries these days? To the point you forgot your shoes and went out for a walk at night?" As someone who was once treated to delicious tea and snacks, I apologize I could not reckon. I want to take off my shoes and clothes right away, but they will not fit, so it will only hurt the sophisticated Count. That. He was going to refuse. It was because he was afraid of what would happen if he received clothes that were full of Klop's body scent rather than the insults. The body that was born as an alpha was changed into an omega just for him. He didn't know what would happen to his body, even if it was broken and unable to experience heat properly, if he smelled a more enticing body scent after not being able to get close to him for a fairly long time. Just the thought of going through heat at the bottom was dreadful. Klop let out a small chuckle when his complexion, which was originally not so dark, turned pale. Then he took something from the inside of his coat and threw it at his dirty feet. Clink. It was a silver coin that gleamed terribly even in the dim light. When Alok looked up at him in bewilderment, Klop projected scorn with his eyes, with not even a hint of a smile in them. "Go and buy some clothes. Only then would anyone believe that you were a count." Before he could say anything, he turned around and strode toward the light without the slightest hesitation. Alok was nailed to the spot until the shadow of the elongated figure gradually faded and disappeared altogether. Chapter 6. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. He held the shiny silver coin in his hand and twirled it around in his hand. It was the first time he had ever touched a silver coin himself. It was insignificant when one owned countless things, and precious when one lost everything. Unlike platinum, the light gray metal, which looked very fragile, was like the crystal of a fleeting dream. Every night, he pondered as the shiny surface reflected against the orange-colored sky. L.rg. Should I buy bread? I could eat and buy a large piece of bread with lots of raisins every day for the next 6 months. I could buy some sugar with it too. It would be nice to buy a blanket for the coming winter. Boots with warm fur could work too. Or taking this to a slightly warmer southern city would be fine. Winters there will not be as harsh as here. What should I do? Alok squatted in the shed and agonized with his face buried in his lap. If he still thought like before, he wouldn't have troubled himself over this to such a degree. He would have immediately gone to the stationery store, buy a pen and papers, and send letters to all the addresses he still remembered. And he won't be able to get a reply to any one of those countless letters. Everyone who once fretted over not getting his invitation now turned away from him. However, Derbyshire and Wolflake, who were once very close to him, refused to even visit. After turning back around without even entering the mansion, no one even acted like they knew Alok. Klopp was the only one who reached out at that hopeless time. In retrospect, it was a path that led him further into the abyss. He couldn't waste his precious money on something pointless, knowing full well that there would be no reply anyway. He wasn't even hungry. It was a golden opportunity that he doubted would come again in the future. He didn't want to spend the precious silver coin on bread that he could get by offering his body anyway. Alok remembered what he wanted most. He never thought that with this money, his dream would become a reality at least once. Alok did not sleep all night and left the shed before the men coming to dispose of their semen stormed in. And until the morning came, he wandered in search of a high-end boutique in his distant memory. By the time the sun rose completely, Alok was kicked out without even entering the high-end boutique properly by the owner, who was afraid of losing the reputation of the boutique. When he begged several times and showed a silver coin, the uptight-looking tailor raised the glasses hanging on the bridge of his nose and laughed coldly. "A single silver coin cannot even buy a tie in my place. Get lost." He was a little surprised. He thought he could buy at least one set of poor-quality clothes with this precious silver coin, if not high-quality ones. It was disappointing that he couldn't even buy a tie that he had worn once before and thrown away. He bit his lips while walking in the shade. All day he snooped around anywhere that looked like a store, but he was lucky if he didn't get hit, let alone treated properly. Eventually, he gave up on the high-end stores along the main street and was able to buy a very old suit and worn-out shoes at the most shabby second-hand clothing store among the stores used by the working class. He paid his only silver coin for it and got some copper coins back. He used those up to buy soap at another store. He excitedly ran to the riverside without realizing it. Before it was too late, he washed himself clean, out of sight of others, and carefully put on clothes that smelled of dust and mildew. He also wore the shoes. He wished he could iron some wrinkles, but he was not allowed that luxury. Alok ran his fingers through his still damp hair, tossed it back, and walked down the street. People glanced at him a little, but they didn't show the hostility they had before. He walked with a pounding heart. Most passed him by, but a young alpha or two stared at him. Alok was terribly afraid as he didn't know the reason why they were staring, and so, chose to walk in a shade that was as inconspicuous as possible. "Excuse me." Someone spoke from behind. When he looked back in surprise, it was a person who was a complete stranger to him. Whilst having a friendly smile on, he hesitated a little before trying to say something more. Behind were those who seemed to be his friends, laughing happily and whispering to each other. Alok got goosebumps. I apologize. There is somewhere I need to be right away." "Oh, could you at least tell me your name?" "Apologies." He quickly responded and quickly increased the distance. The stranger seemed to follow him for a bit but then walked away. Alok was so startled that his heart almost jumped out. He was wearing shoes that didn't fit, and his heels were sore and hurting, but that didn't make him slow down. After more than 2 hours of walking, Alok found himself at the end of a rather neat street where the middle class of the city lived. Beyond this street, the other side was an area lined with mansions of nobles. He had to walk for dozens of minutes to pass through the gate of one mansion. As opposed to other streets of the city where there are many pedestrians, there was almost no one walking around in this area since everyone used carriages here. If some were occasionally seen walking around, it was only when the servants of each mansion looked around once in a while to prevent strangers from approaching. When he was kicked out of this place for the first time, he was often kicked out by the servants after coming back on his own without thinking about his appearance. There were several times when he was beaten to the point of losing his mind while resisting. Alok moved his feet while forcibly straightening his stiff shoulders. Fortunately, the servant passing by from the other side looked at him with a bit of a wary look, but he didn't try to catch him. It was thanks to the outfit that was not much different from his even if it was old and smelled a little dusty. Still, Alok felt prickles on the nape of his neck and increased his walking speed. It was not until late afternoon after walking for a long time despite entering the aristocratic area that he could stand in front of a really splendid and huge mansion with a row of cedar trees standing out on both sides of the mansion. Next to the high main gate made of steel, there was a copper plate engraved with the name of the owner of the house on the pillar decorated with fancy stone statues. What had once been inscribed with T. Wind had now been changed to Bandyke. The steel gate and the entrance of the mansion were separated by a huge garden that couldn't be seen at a glance, so no one would hear Alok even if he screamed from there. As he was wandering around, a carriage started coming in from afar. A woman he knew well was riding in a small two-person carriage, not a closed coach used by nobles. The middle-aged Omega woman, who had a considerable amount of presence, saw Alok standing in front of the mansion, opened her eyes wide, then narrowed them again and stopped the carriage. The gatekeeper, noticing that the carriage was entering, approached from far inside. "Hello, Count. What brings you here?" "Martha." When the gatekeeper, whom the new owner of the mansion, Viscount Bandyke, had hired several years ago, had only remembered seeing his face once and had never heard of his name before, opened the gate, Martha nodded her head and drove the carriage inside. It seemed that she was buying the items necessary for a housekeeper separately. He would have been able to get in if he asked her, but somehow he couldn't speak up. Thinking of what he had done before, he had no face to ask her for a difficult request. It was better to wait for Klopp like this. He would come out or go in at some point. As he stood there without saying anything, the gatekeeper with a cold look in his eyes glanced at Alok and then went back to the mansion. Klopp was originally the second son of Baron Bandyke, who owned a small local estate. Compared to the high-ranking aristocrats in the capital, he once had nothing in the humble status closer to that of a commoner, though that was not the case anymore. He was a self-made businessman and a brilliant investor who was enthusiastically welcomed even in the exclusive high society of the royal court. All government bond-related projects he has touched on were making huge profits, and he had made a great contribution to the country by attracting immense benefits in diplomatic negotiations related to the economy. At the same time, he had recently received a title, although it was unknown what kind of deal he had made under the table with the protection of numerous nobles on his back. It was not the common title of a knight, rather he was given the title of Viscount, citing the fact that he was from a family of barons. To receive a hereditary title at the present time was tremendously unconventional. There were many rumors and overstatements that surrounded him. In particular, there were countless rumors about the 5-year period of disappearance after losing his beloved spouse and unborn child at the hands of hoodlums. No one knew where he was or what he did during that time. It was only when he reappeared in the city's high society that he swayed the economy of the major city with great wealth in his hands. On the other hand, everything of Alok was falling apart. The assets disappeared somewhere and the business in which he invested failed. He invested a lot of money because he was a trustworthy person, but he was also scammed. It was strange. No matter how bad Alok's eye for investments was, it was not bad enough to continue to suffer such a huge loss. It was as if someone had set a trap and waited. Soon after, Alok ran out of his fortunes and was under a mountain of debt. Despite his pride, he asked for help from those around him, but everyone turned a blind eye. At that time, Alok was devastated and eventually had no choice but to sell his mansion. It was because he could not afford the debt that multiplied several times overnight even though he had sold all his other properties. The mansion, with its particularly beautiful rose garden, now belonged to the powerful economic bureaucrat, Klopp Bandyke. Now, Alok was waiting for the owner of the mansion where he was born. Just as the sky was slowly turning to gold, the gatekeeper came out from the inside again. "Is the Count there?" He quickly got up from leaning against the wall and stood in front of him. The gatekeeper looked at Alok up and down in disbelief. He straightened her shoulders, raised his head straight, and looked at the gatekeeper. "The Viscount invited you, so please come in." The gatekeeper opened the gates and moved back. "Did Martha tell him?" Alok gave the gatekeeper a simple nod and entered the residence. The garden he looked around on the way to the front door had retained its old appearance. It hadn't even been a few years, but faint memories came back little by little as if it were the distant past. He wondered if the rose garden, which his mother, whose face he could hardly remember now, loved so much was still there, but it was not right to roam around without the owner's permission. Upon reaching the front door, a butler dressed neatly in a black suit came out. It was a young man, not the old butler of T. Wyn's, who had been taking care of the mansion for decades. Aylock followed the unfamiliar butler to the living room. The interior decoration of the mansion was also almost the same. It was because the decorations were handed over all at once because he was in a hurry to dispose of them. If there was one thing that changed, it was the portraits. Most of the portraits hanging on the walls were replaced with other paintings. Among them was the work of a genius new artist whom Aylock had been keeping an eye on. He must have become a very successful painter to decorate the living room walls of one of the most influential aristocrats in the country. Chapter 7 You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Aylock was a little pleased that his discerning eye was right on this one. He had no talent for investing, but he had an eye for art. Aylock, after being ushered to a living room where there was no one, took a look at the paintings slowly. Admiring art in the familiar living room whilst wearing a suit, which felt a bit unfamiliar, he felt as if he had gone back to the past. He straightened his shoulders a bit, and his chin pulled up on its own. Aylock, with a subtle smile on his face, examined the artist's delicate brushstrokes. That painting was sold for almost the price of a house at the auction. It was a fairly good investment. Klopp broke in from behind when he entered. Though Aylock was startled, due to his aristocratic education, he simply took a step away from the painting with a slight nod, as if he had known he was there from earlier. It is a very delicate painting and incorporates a lot of emotions within. The painter probably loved this space. That is why he poured all the glimmer into such a bold color. I do not think this is the only one that painted such a scene. I think he painted several works depending on the season or time. If it is a series, collecting them will increase the value. This is early summer in the series of 4 seasons. Other works are in question. Aylock nodded and cast his gaze at Klopp. You have a good eye. This is probably an early work, but you managed to notice it. He was a little short of breath and his heart was a little tense, but it wasn't unbearable. Klopp's gaze toward him was similar to when he saw him on the street last night. The slight difference was that if the eyes were full of cold contempt at the time, now there was a little admiration and corresponding disgust. The conversation was cut off. The dark eyes still glared at him with cold hatred, and Aylock did not dare to say anything in front of him. He only moved his eyelids slightly and looked at the faintly trembling hand of the man. It seemed that he provoked him again, though Aylock didn't exactly know how. He was a little anxious that that big, warm hand that slowly curled up might fly towards his cheek. It hurts to get hit, but more than that, he might be kicked out immediately if he angered Klopp. Half of his wish was still yet to be fulfilled. Aylock smiled at the Alpha, who was always angry, to prove that he meant no malice. But apparently, that wasn't a very good choice. Klopp clenched his fist so hard to the point his knuckles turned white. Just as he was trying to step back, fearing that he might get hit, it was the butler who came in with a tea set that broke the chilly atmosphere. He modestly nodded at his master as a greeting gesture and set the tray on the table. Klopp, who had been emitting deep hatred, slightly relaxed his expression and offered a seat to Aylock with a cold smile. Though he was still scared, Aylock nodded slightly and went to sit down in front of the table. The tea served by the butler was a high-quality black tea that he used to enjoy drinking in the past. As he took a sip of the warm liquid, Aylock seemed to relax a bit. It had been a long time since he drank tea. No, it was the first tea he drank after leaving this mansion. Before, a sip of this tea was nothing, but now he was so grateful that he thought he might write out a long and lengthy ode about it. While he wrapped both hands around the teacup and felt its warmth, Klopp spoke first. You look much better than last time, Count. Rather than being particularly sarcastic, he spoke calmly, but it felt fierce enough to tighten the pit of his stomach for a moment. Alok didn't want to show his slightly trembling fingers, so he let go of the teacup and lowered his hands under the table. Thanks to you. How did you find your way here? What do you mean? To Alok's question, Klopp responded as he leaned against the backrest and crossed his legs. It has been 2 years since you did not come to this mansion, no. It is simply a common house to me, but to you, is it not like a home? I was a little disappointed that I had not been able to see you around. Even though he said that, there was absolutely no sincerity in those words. Klopp was so eloquent that the expression, Viscount Bandyke, was now more appropriate, as opposed to the genuineness he would once show when felt unpleasant that had also now vanished. In other words, it also meant that each and every one of his sarcastic remarks were properly piercing Alok. I was occupied with this and that. Actually, he had tried to come to this mansion several times. He went through a lot of things until he realized that it was a vain hope and a false dream and that it was hard to say whether or not it could be fulfilled in this lifetime, but he didn't find the need to say it all. Even if Klopp had a good reason, would it be necessary to describe in detail the miserable times that he does not want to recall in order to please the insatiable man? After taking another sip of the slightly lukewarm tea, Alok looked quietly at Klopp. Now all he wanted was one thing. Although they were lives that were born in a way that he never thought of or wanted at all, it was an unchanging fact that they were Alok's blood. He wanted to hug those angels at least once. He wanted them to know who gave birth to them. That was all. He had no desire to let them know what he had done, what punishment he was paying for, and where and how he was living now. The small children don't have to live with a dark past like the original sinner just because they were born out of his womb. He just wanted to see if they were living happily under the care of Klopp, who had chosen such a cruel method for revenge. After a while, Alok made up his mind and opened his mouth, facing the dagger. Like gaze that was stabbing him. He is a beautiful child. Klopp's slightly smiling lips twitched a little. Deep brown eyes shone terribly. The thin mask he was wearing, who looked plainly angry, cracked a little. Klopp's lips trembled slightly as he glared at him as if he would break his neck at any moment, and then a confident sneer erupted again. When did you see him? Coincidentally the other day. When he answered meekly, Klopp snorted, ha. Then, he rested his chin on his hand and looked at Alok carefully. It seemed as if he was judging if what he said was true or not. The child does not look like you. It was an appeal prepared for a certain degree of threat. Even if there was an argument or violence that was too much to handle, he had to try it first. If he lost this opportunity, he couldn't guarantee when he'll see them next time. Alok made a firm resolve inwardly and deliberately looked at the cold opponent, pretending to be calm so as not to back down. However, Klopp didn't seem quite shaken by that, only the corners of his mouth trembled slightly, and he immediately replied in a light voice. Well, that is because he resembles my spouse. He didn't understand at first. No, for a moment, he wondered if Klopp was crazy again. He would never think of him that way. He blinked my eyes several times and couldn't close his mouth before suddenly realizing it. Oh. The hope that had barely kept his composure had been shattered into a myriad of pieces. He wanted to scream and have a mental breakdown right away. However, thanks to the suit and shoes that tightened the body, and the scent of tea that revived the old teachings of an aristocrat, he unconsciously responded with a deeper smile. The tea was good. The scent of it is nice. I would like to drink more, but I think I need to leave. Are you leaving already? As he stood up, Klopp asked in a sarcastic tone. Thank you for serving me tea when it is not the right time for it. You will not be able to go far. He did not even stand up. Alok left the living room and the mansion without looking back. The gatekeeper saw him walking at a slightly quicker pace from afar and opened the gates without saying anything. He couldn't even thank him and had to leave the mansion with a pale face. Sure, it would be a lie to say that he didn't expect it at all. He once thought it himself. The reason why he didn't think about it deeply was that he wanted to leave a bit of room. Room for the belief that one day Klopp will forgive and accept him. But that was nothing more than a false delusion. The hatred of the man who lost his beloved wife and child was greater and stronger than anything Alok could have imagined. Even in the midst of a life where everything was destroyed or lost, those who had a grudge did not stop taking revenge. Everything was futile. No matter how hard he tried, Klopp would not let him off the hook. He just realized that. After years of miserable and wretched days, along with the weight of his sins, his rationality knew it, but it was the first time he consciously realized it. The street, paved with smooth stones, now looked muddy and it felt as if legs had gone into them knee-deep. He hadn't seen or heard anything since he happened to see Klopp that day and fell in love with him. Raphael also met him later than he did. He, with dark brown hair and deep eyes, was of course entitled to having his own person, but Alok was very angry when he was intercepted in the middle. He firmly believed that he, who was superior in family background, wealth, beauty, and talent, was better than poor Raphael, who had nothing outstanding except that he was an Omega who could give birth to children. Being an Alpha, he had no choice but to put up with it, but not anymore. The drug, which he was half forced and half tricked into taking by Klopp, possessed by intense hatred, turned the Alpha into an Omega. If you took my wife and child from me, you should pay me back. For the sake of him who said that, even after compensating for the lost child, he gave birth to another. Even if he sinned, he didn't exactly mean for something like that to happen. Because he lost his property and family and paid for his sins. He thought it would be okay since the arrogant side of him had all disappeared while he was rolling around on the streets. He thought that one day Klopp would let him off the hook. How could a dead person defeat a living person? But now he that saw it, he knew that was not the case. The living could not beat the dead. In Klopp's memory, it was clear that Raphael would forever be engraved as a beautiful and kind figure. Forever, so that the shabby and withered Alok could never soil him again. It felt like it was getting hot under his eyes. It was as if tears were on the verge of flowing out. But he couldn't cry. He had never cried in my life, so he had forgotten how to cry. He wanted to cry but couldn't, so Alok trudged along, unable to hide his distorted and ugly face, swallowing the bitter liquid that was burning inside. Perhaps the two children will live without knowing Alok for the rest of their lives. They would be told that the man who gave birth to them sadly passed away a long time ago because of a bad nobleman. Yes. Maybe that was better. It was better than passing the guilt on to them. If they were the children of his wife, Klopp would at least love them unconditionally. The thought made Alok a little happy. It hurt a lot, but he was so happy that he felt like crying again. However, no matter how much he grimaced and made sobbing noises, no tears flowed from his dried-up body. The flushed cheeks were very hot. He continued to walk, cloaked in the blood-red sunset. There weren't many places to go. He headed for the place where he once sent away the pedals, with the rattling noise of the old shoe heels. Maybe today, he would send away his own light body like a dry straw that blew everything away. Chapter 8. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. When Alok opened his eyes, he thought for a moment whether there was a barn in the fiery pit of hell. But he soon changed his thoughts. The place where he was lying was not the shed he had been using until now. It was a small humble cottage, and he was lying in what could be called a bed, albeit a rough one, and was covered with a clean blanket. He slowly got up. The last thing that came to mind was cold water. But now, the place where Alok opened his eyes was obviously a dry room. He didn't understand how it happened. Under the sliding blanket, his naked body came into view. Though he washed his skin hard with soap, he still couldn't get rid of the old grime, but the smooth and clean skin did not look like that of a street bum, even with the scars and bruises. When he brought his nose close to his arm, he could smell the scent of fragrant flowers. It was as if he entered and came out of the water with high-quality bath salts. He brought my legs together neatly, placed them on the floor, and got off the bed. He found a table by relying on the faint light that came through the tightly closed wooden window shutters. There was probably a sturdy and large table around here. Also, on top of it, he felt a soft fabric that smelled like the sunlight. Alok hugged it and inhaled its scent deeply. There was no smell of the gutter. For some reason, his heart swelled. It was not a forced mask-like smile, but a genuine smile of joy, buried in the cloth and remained there for a long time. Then, slowly, he put it on. As expected, it was a little short in length. However, it was not so uncomfortable since he was so skinny. As long as he didn't button up the sleeves and the neck, it was fine. His wrists and ankles were sticking out through the ends, but it didn't bother him because there was no one who would make fun of him here. Alok, fully dressed, rubbed out the soft texture with his palms and opened the closed window shutters. A bright light streamed in and he had to cover his eyes with his hand. After blinking a few times, his eyes began to adjust to the light with a feeling of drowsiness. Right then, he could see the scenery outside the window. Not far away, beyond the walls of the cedar trees that stood like bars, the very mansion he saw yesterday revealed its majesty. On the other side of the huge mansion, the tips of cedar trees stretching toward the sky poked out their heads elaborately, like saplings, driven by perspective. He didn't know what had happened the previous night, but he knew that Klopp had brought him here. Clearly, meeting him yesterday had some other bad consequences. Alok was afraid of what kind of terrible torture he had prepared for him, who had a genius talent for causing pain. It seemed that he was unable to die of his own volition. Fortunately, however, Klopp did not abandon him on the streets again but kept him locked up here. At the very least, he won't starve or freeze to death as long as he was here. He would not be subjected to gang rape either. Instead, there would be no conversation, even if it was a worthless combination of sounds and no human body heat. Still, compared to the bottom, this place was like heaven. It wasn't because he was less beaten, less cold, or less hungry. As long as he stayed in this cottage, Alok could wait for Klopp to come to see him. The first day he spent time sitting on the bed in a daze. He just couldn't believe it. After a terrible time that seemed like an eternity, he didn't feel like he was back here again, so he went in and out of the cottage several times. He circled the small tree house in anticipation of someone coming through the cedar trees that he did not dare to cross. Nothing had changed since Alok used it in the past. Then, when hunger arrived, he came to his senses. In addition to the space used throughout the cottage as a bedroom/sitting room or living room, there was a small kitchen situated around the corner. He had never been there before when he was here. When he opened the door, which had been creaking since it had not been used for a long time, acrid dust rose. He thought it would be better to clean up first. He picked up a bucket and a half-rotten mop from the corner. Then he went to the well outside the cottage. The well was a hand pump. When he first encountered this pump on the street, he remembered being very embarrassed because he did not know how to use it. Fortunately, someone by his side had already brought a bucket full of water. It was meticulous solicitude. Alok lifted the metal bucket carefully so as not to spill any water and poured it halfway into the opening above the pump. And he moved the handle hard. Clear water gushed out of the pump which had been gurgling. He crawled across the floor with his not-so-skillful hands until his knees were sore, and wiped away the dust all around. And anything that caught his eye was wiped with a rag. Alok's forehead was covered with sweat by the time the place was clean enough to be called one's dwelling, though it was obviously not to the level of an experienced housekeeper's maintenance. After being in a prostrating position for a long time, blood rushed to his pale face, turning it slightly red. The stomach, which had been hungry since earlier, made a louder noise because of the physical labor. On the table where the clothes were placed, some root vegetables such as potatoes and carrots and green vegetables such as asparagus and cabbage were placed with salt. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could eat without cooking. He found a small knife in the kitchen and decided to try chopping up the potatoes first. He put a round potato on the table and smacked it with the knife, but it missed. The potatoes were firm, not soft. He had never imagined that potatoes could be this hard. He tried the carrots and it was hard too. Cabbage, too. Asparagus was tough. How do you cook these strong things? Alok pondered. He was hungry, but he thought it would be a fairly enjoyable time. It wasn't until late at night that Alok managed to get control of the potato. Before he could eat it, which had shrunk considerably from its original size, he cut 3 fingers and burned one because of the hot pot. Even with the firewood outside the pot and the given matches, he couldn't light the fire properly, so after agonizing over it for a long time, he burned a little bit of his long hair as well. After blowing on a half-cooked, half-burnt baked potato and eating it, Alok took off his clothes, hung them on a chair, and climbed onto the bed naked. Due to the heavy labor, he was very tired today. Unfortunately, there were no lamps, so when the sun went down, there was nothing to do. Truthfully, even if there was a lamp, there was still nothing to do. The physical fatigue pushed away all the painful memories of the past that came every night and allowed him to sleep soundly without thinking about anything. It felt like a cool breeze brushed his cheeks in his sleep. He had to get up to check what it was, but he was too tired to open my eyes. If it had been a barn or a street, he would have woken up before the wind blew and crawled into the deep shade, but this was a cottage. No one came here except for that person. He isn't coming, is he? It must be the wind in the garden coming through the closed shutters. The cool breeze made him feel good. Alok seemed to have smiled a little even in his sleep. He woke up suddenly in the dark of dawn. He rubbed his eyes and got up, and reached for his clothes, but then something else came into Alok's eyes. A lamp, soap, and clean towels were placed on the table. It was clear that someone had come and gone. As far as Alok could remember, only one other person had been in and out of the cottage besides himself. Other servants would bring various items outside the door, but they never came inside. Alok, unable to wear anything, ran out of the cottage with nothing on. Clop. He quickly ran to the cedar wall. Along the wall to the path leading to the rose garden on the other side. But he couldn't go any further than that. It was difficult to get out of here. If he was nearby and saw Alok stepping into the mansion, he might throw him out again. It was forbidden to wish for anything other than what was given. The only thing he was permitted was a cottage. Alok stood on his tiptoes to find the figure of a tall, broad-shouldered man. No matter how many times he put his head out, he couldn't see anything. He called him again. Clop. No response came back. No one seemed to be there. Then, when a brisk wind blew and he realized again that he was not wearing any clothes, he quietly returned to the cottage. The embers that still hadn't died out were so painful that he tried to extinguish them by sinking into the river, but this time too, he was pulled out and a bellows was used to make them flare up again. He didn't even have any flesh left to burn anyway. Now, Alok looked forward to the heat that even made his bones hot. He saved his life, so if Alok were to keep staying alive, someday he would look back on him at least once. That's why he didn't want to miss this chance by being selfish like before. One day, when the time comes when he wants to talk face-to-face, he would come and wake him up. Until then, all Alok could do was wait for a better look. He tried roasting carrots for breakfast but cut himself in the same spot he did the day before. He put his bleeding finger in his mouth and opened the box that Clop had brought him at dawn. He saw a white bandage. He cut a small piece of thick fabric and wrapped it around his finger. It did hurt a little. In addition, he also closed the wounds from yesterday that were quite long. When he looked down at his hands, he suddenly remembered the white band that had touched the smiling lips of that person. In doing so, he could still vividly see the image of the two lovely people with one kissing the other's fingers as if his wounds heal quickly. Chapter 9. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Hello, Count T. Wind. Raphael, coming across Aylock at Viscount Derbyshire's tea party, greeted him with a bright smile. Truthfully, Aylock didn't want to act like he knew him, but Klopp was standing one step behind the happy Omega, looking at him, so he forced himself to reply with a polite smile. Dovico, hello, Raphael. The weather is very nice today. I wish it was always like this. Even though it was a simple reply, Raphael intentionally clapped in an exaggerated manner and giggled. Aylock was deeply displeased by the fake laugh hitting his ears, but he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled brightly at the Alpha, who was standing behind the Omega with a stiff expression, and greeted him with a nod. All that came back was a slight nod. Grumpiness arose. You do not have to be this cold. Aylock looked down at the Omega standing in front of his eyes again, raising the corners of his mouth that had already been raised considerably. White bands were wrapped around Raphael's fingers as he put his hands together in front of his mouth to look cute. You seem to have hurt your fingers. Oh, I was practicing cooking a while ago. Cooking. I learned how to trim fish. But I cut myself due to my own clumsiness. Aylock frowned slightly at those words. As future hostesses of aristocratic families, there were those who learned to bake sweets, and bread, or take lessons on tea ceremonies. However, it was too much to use a kitchen knife to trim a fish. When he looked closer, Raphael's hands had minor scars everywhere in addition to the bands, and the back of his hand, which should have been soft and smooth, looked a little rough. Is Viscount Westport facing such financial difficulties? To the point where he is making the eldest son cook? Raphael, who was showing his hands without knowing it was embarrassing, blushed belatedly and lowered his hands to hide them behind his waist. After all, no matter how distant the relations were, he was a cousin of the T. Wind family. In addition, because of their similar appearance, there had been frequent talks about the connection between the two families recently. In such a situation, if rumors about Raphael cutting his fingers while trimming a fish spread among noble families, Aylock will be treated as a horrible miser who does not take care of his relatives even though he has amassed an enormous fortune, or as a fool who doesn't even know the difficulties of his relatives. He thought he had an aristocratic eye for things because he was dressed in modest clothes of good quality but understated embellishments, but even that seemed to be his own misunderstanding. No matter how much he didn't like Raphael, helping a relative was one of the obligations of nobles. Aylock spoke in a tone that was careful not to reveal his annoyance as much as possible. I will inform my butler to send a suitable cook. All the expenses, along with the ingredients, are borne by me. You will not have to touch anything like fish in the future. I apologize for not noticing earlier. That is not the case. Raphael tried to refuse with a flustered expression. Then, he glanced at Klopp standing behind him as if he was perplexed. Maybe he didn't want this to be discovered in front of the person he was dating. If so, then he shouldn't have come out with the bands wrapped around his fingers. When Aylock looked at him with knitted brows, Raphael couldn't meet his gaze and lowered his eyes. Even if he had to suffer from poverty, he didn't like accepting it servilely, so when he told him to raise his head, Klopp stepped forward from behind and stood by Raphael's side. He lowered his big hand, held the bandaged-wrapped hand tightly, and stared coldly at Aylock, who was surprised at his display of affection in front of others. Soon an unpleasant voice flew in. There is no need for that, Raphael. You have done nothing wrong, so do not lower your head as if you are guilty. If anyone is at fault, then it is mine for not being competent enough to not let my future spouse go through such hardships. Upon hearing that, Aylock was taken aback. He only thought that Raphael was embarrassing himself, but he didn't expect Klopp to come forward like that. In fact, in the literal sense, Klopp's position had little to say. Even if you're not rich, you cannot have your aristocratic fiancé handle the fish himself. What would he do if the engagement ring with a barely visible gem emanated a fishy smell? If it's that difficult, secretly ask for help and at least buy a glove and give it as a gift. Even though it was a shabby appearance that Aylock couldn't easily overlook, Klopp didn't seem to think so. He proudly defended Raphael, whose face had turned red. "Excuse us." After a short salutation, the two left. That evening, while waiting for the coach, Klopp took care of his fiancée's hands as much he could, lest he gets hurt. Aylock, standing at the table, caressed the cold surface a little with his fingertips, feeling a slight pulsation. Then he raised his hand and brought it to his lips. He thought it wouldn't hurt this way, but it didn't make much of a difference. Maybe it's because it was not his kiss. That day, Raphael didn't really seem to be in pain. The days passed peacefully and sometimes a little boring. On the contrary, Aylock's heart only grew more and more excited. As each day passed, he couldn't calm down as if the promised date was approaching. He didn't know when he would appear, but he was sure that he would come at least once. This time, he didn't go to sleep until late at night so as not to miss him. In order to conserve the lamp's light, he sat in bed at night with his forehead resting on his knees and waited tirelessly. If he heard anything outside, he quickly turned on the lamp. And he looked out the window. After looking around for a long time, the day of waiting continued with the lamp turned off after covering himself with a blanket. He couldn't sleep well, so he fell asleep in the middle of the night involuntarily, and was startled by the chirping of birds passing by. He calmed his pounding heart and called out, "Klopp," but, as expected, only the leaves that brushed against the wind answered back. Waiting was always rewarded. It was one late afternoon, just as he was about to take off his clothes that were soiled with charcoal stains to wash them. The thread of the cloth flowed from the old, ripped buttonhole and twined around the button. He couldn't take it off properly because of that. At first, he tried to carefully unravel the thread little by little, but he got agitated since his fingertips hadn't healed yet. Even if it was uncomfortable since it was so small, so Aylock was taking off his clothes almost as if he were tearing them off in an unusually aggressive manner. Rattle. The door opened. To begin with, there was no lock, but the door, which did not move unless Aylock touched it, opened wide and a tall man entered. Aylock, holding the half-torn garment in his hand and twisting off the button with the thread that had just been caught around his neck, stopped. Klopp. Klopp, wearing a coat, hat, and even gloves, looked at him with a slightly serious expression as usual. Seeing Aylock staring at him in surprise with nothing on his upper body, the sneering Alpha immediately cast his gaze at the rags in his skinny hands. The corner of the man's mouth, which had been drawing a confident arc, stiffened into a straight line and trembled slightly. "What are you doing?" "Oh, these damn clothes are so nasty." Aylock was embarrassed because he couldn't even get dressed properly due to the sudden intrusion, and ended up using harsh words, blaming them for nothing. Even after saying that, he felt like a vulgar person, so Aylock lowered his eyes a little. There was no need to drop the level of his innate nature to that of the bottom. It seems that it was inevitable to be affected by the environment, in spite of his efforts not to. He was a little worried about the clever sarcastic remarks that would be thrown at him. After a moment of silence, Klopp took off his black silk hat, set it on the table, and strode towards him. Then, he snatched the clothes from Aylock's hands. A somewhat startled Aylock looked up at him, who took off his black leather glove, raised his hand, and slapped his thin cheek. Slap. Aylock's head sharply turned to the side. Stars splattered in front of his eyes, and before Aylock came to his senses, a hand as strong as steel grabbed his thin chin, turned it around, and slapped him on the cheek again. The body that had been released from the first shock could not stand it this time and collapsed. Aylock fell to the floor and spat out what was pooling in his mouth. A little blood flowed. Before he could understand what had happened or why he had to be hit, Klopp took off his other glove and this time his coat as well, put them on a nearby chair, looked down at Aylock with a cold expression, and unbuttoned his cuffs. "Why? Why, you ask? You still dare not know your purpose?" He had absolutely no idea what he did wrong. When he felt the heat on his already swollen cheeks, Klopp grabbed Alok by the hair and hit him several more times. Alok's mouth burst open and he tasted something stingy and salty, and he coughed reflexively as the saliva and blood that flowed mixed with each other were about to pass down his panting throat. At that moment, something hot flowed from his nostrils. Alok's brain was shaken from being hit in the head, and his vision was blurry, so it was hard to come to his senses. He thought it would be better to get hit on the thigh or back. Chloe. Do you remember now? You should have. It was left behind by someone who died in dreadful horror because of you. I gave these to you so you could always remember the sins you committed, so how dare you soil and tear them up? How dare you say that with this hideous body? The enraged Alpha's voice was terrifying enough to give him goosebumps, and at the same time, the pain was so intense that his heart froze. Alok thought it was small because he simply brought him some random old clothes. The slightly old-fashioned and plain clothes had a soft texture of good quality, so it was vaguely assumed by him that they were old clothes of some noble that was thrown away. But they weren't. These were Raphael's clothes. Even if he didn't know, he still tore them up in front of Klopp. It was a mistake not to be made. But regardless, he did it. Alok should have recognized the clothes, which sent Klopp into a fit of rage and exercise uncharacteristic violence once again. But, as always, Alok's realization came late. He did what he deserved in the face of his sins. Alok silently accepted Klopp's violence. T/N. Yes, this has been dropped here but also picked up by a lovely translator on another site. Please search this novel on NU for further details. Thank you for reading thus far. Volume 1 Chapter 5.1. Love Again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Note: this chapter continues from Chapter 9, V1C4, in Novel Updates. Read the NSFW content here. Alok rose up and stretched his arms out to pick up some clothes. The wide-open maternity dress was mostly fine, but the shoulder part was very narrow, so he had no choice but to rip it off and sew it with another piece of cloth. His sewing skills were clearly very clumsy, thus the messy wrinkles looked like a clown's frill. To think that you're showing your face around in that attire as a noble. If it were me, I would die of shame. That was Klopp's impression when he saw this before. Of course, he didn't actually mean to die. He was just returning what Alok might have said somewhere before. It wasn't even that shameful. Too much had happened to Alok to make him blush over an outfit. Klopp, who remembered every small thing like that, and Alok himself, who understood his intentions completely, laughed for a little. Wrapped up in ridiculous clothes, Alok ate some meat that he had baked yesterday with boiled eggs and raw carrots. The boiled eggs had cracked somewhere, making the yolk pale. He originally liked soft boiled eggs, but such delicate dishes were still difficult for him to cook. For Alok, who still had a small scar from getting hit by exploding eggshell on his forehead when he put a raw egg in a heated oven, boiling an egg was a great improvement for him. But it was a pity when the cracked egg would break out. However, with his weak fingers, peeling hard-boiled eggs was more convenient, so Alok always preferred it that way. However, only over-easy eggs were left today. He wanted to eat the smooth whites, but the eggs in the corner of the table were soon crushed into a mess. Alok licked the yolk on his hands and used his fingertips to eat the whites sticking to the shells. The whole table was a mess. His clothes were stained with a few drops of juice falling from the half burned meat. As he patted his clothes, he saw the bed. The sheets with all kinds of body fluids mixed together looked dirty. Wearing clean clown clothes was better than that. A dirty bed and clothes wouldn't be very good for the baby. Alok thought about doing his laundry today. His pregnant belly had become quite heavy, but it wasn't interfering with his movements yet. After Alok had a good breakfast, he raised his arms and took off the sheets, pillows, and his clothes. He held them all together and put them under the manual water pump. Alok did his best to wash them. It was a much better situation compared to the river before, but Alok was still struggling because he didn't know how to wash them properly. Alok tried hard to rub the soap with his hands. Alok got his hands and feet soaked in cold water all day to wash them. At one point, Alok's clothes were soaking wet and he got very hungry. After crouching down for so long, when he lifted his body, he felt dizzy. After wringing the sheets that he washed with difficulty using his flushed hands, he laid the damp heavy sheets out on a low shrub growing nearby, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. It was already afternoon. Alok decided to eat boiled potatoes and vegetables before continuing his laundry. He looked at the bed and suddenly realized something. He washed all the blankets, so what would he sleep with tonight? Alok tried to be positive and thought that the blankets would dry up before sunset, but the water was still dripping down even after sunset. The other clothes that he had laid out as he was washing the blanket were still wet too and he didn't have anything to wear. Why did he wash the cover and the rug at the same time like a fool? Stupid. The feeling of regret was now friends with Alok. He thought that it was amazing that even little things were making him regretful, and he rolled up his body as close as possible and went to sleep rubbing his cold hands and feet. He didn't know when he fell asleep, but when he woke up, it was already late at night. He was sure he slept without a blanket, but his body felt hot enough to sweat, and his head was hurting painfully. On the contrary, his hands and feet were so cold that he trembled. It seemed like he was having a cold. This was expected as he was soaked in cold water doing heavy labor during the day and slept on a cold night without a blanket. His knees, which were clattering against the wooden bed, even made rattling sounds. It had been a long time since Alok had been this sick. He couldn't afford to be sick when he was outside. The fear of not knowing where and what would happen if he lost consciousness drove away the pain. So he kept walking around even if his body was bloodied. Compared to back then, he could fall sick in this place. Also, the man who came through that door would give Alok everything. There was no need to be vigilant. He let out his hot breath and looked at the door that could not be distinguished in this darkness. That man hadn't come yet today. Alok wondered what happened. Beyond being an outstanding investor, he was now a trusted business bureaucrat, so he must be busy. As he already had 2 children, the third child who came out of nowhere from this bad relationship might not mean anything to him. Nevertheless, waiting for him was inevitable. Alok listened quietly, for it made no difference whether his eyes were open or closed. The sound of the wind sweeping through the rose garden, the sound of a distant cedar branch bumping, and the sad whistle of a cypress tree. While hoping that he would hear footsteps in between those sounds.